Some time ago, somebody asked me on Twitter how I matched the sprites in Slash's Keep to the environment. So I thought that's something I could discuss here as well. So in short, I didn't, not really. I mean, I didn't do any fancy shader magic. Whenever I write shaders, in fact, I feel like I'm writing to a pen pal from another planet. The long version of what I did with the drawn sprites is I tweaked the lighting and the light placement until I got a reasonably uniform image across all gameplay situations. So I only had to draw the sprites to match that. I used a lighting ramp that gets overlaid over the base texture, like the Photoshop blending mode overlay, though not exactly the same. And that ramp texture I could tweak exactly to my liking. So the game uses deferred lighting, so all the lights get aggregated and then they're all pumped through the same toon ramp. So there are only ever as many color combinations as there are stages on the ramp texture, as opposed to having multiple lights blending their own ramps, which would end up looking like watercolors or something. And I wanted a clean and clear cartoon style. No fancy stuff. No fuss, you know. Then the darkest parts are defined by the ambient color, which needed to be dark, but not too dark, because I couldn't rely on the randomized light placement to illuminate everything perfectly. Speaking of which, that's another ordeal, what with the random generation of rooms and all that's in them. Ideally, they're spaced apart equally and none of that taxing dynamic light gets wasted. The whole thing is a non-issue, of course, with pre-made levels with baked lighting, which I am very much looking forward to in future projects. So when I was drawing the sprites, I mostly guessed at the values I had to use, and I ended up correcting a lot of sprites later on. Also, I redrew a lot of them since they were no longer up to par on an artistique level. I have standards I have to meet, you know. And for some of them, I color-picked values from screenshots, like this alcove statue here. Really, I should have done that for all sprites, like make a base color palette texture and run it through the engine, as in place it, light it, and make a screenshot. But, you know, I couldn't be bothered, to be honest. You know, it never ceases to amaze me how much of the whole thing is smoke and mirrors, right? Players don't realize how restrictive just the technical considerations of each individual project are, let alone general performance concerns, you know. Like baked lighting looks amazing with all the bounced light and stuff, but it's completely static since, you know, there's no light there. It's just painted on. And it's not just lighting or graphics in general that postulates the restrictions, right? Generally, I would say whenever a game makes apparent some decision by the developers which is puzzling to the player, there will be a reason for it. And it may be one that you might never know unless you've been involved in the project. But you can be fairly sure it's not, well, the devs are just stupid. Anyway, here's an important point I wanted to make on the topic of graphics and presentation. It's a visual medium. You can tell yourself all sorts of things about how gameplay is the most important thing, or story, or I've read some people say it's voice acting. That's the most important thing, but your video game will not be sufficiently stimulating to the senses if your visuals are ass. Now, people who are not visual artists may not be able to put their finger on why, but they too like pretty pictures. If that weren't the case, every game and every movie would look awful. In fact, they wouldn't exist. So if you have no skill or inclination towards visual art, you have to get someone to work with you who does. Or attain those skills yourself. And regardless of the type of game you're making, I think you should look at every frame the game may generate as an intentional composition, if possible. Which is obviously a lofty goal, unattainable in fact, but that's what you should strive for. Really, it's the same thing you're doing when designing the gameplay, right? You're always thinking of what could possibly happen based on the game mechanics and player input. So accordingly, you should think about what the screen looks like while that's going on. You know, sometimes you see indie projects that rely on a clever mechanic, and it could be like a platformer with the little guy or girl in the middle, and then the rest of the screen looks barren, like just basic shapes and a repeating texture, and consequently the game looks unfinished. Also, now that there are so many ready-made solutions for high-fidelity graphics, some developers seem to be aiming for an ultra-realistic style, the kind that only AAA productions can realistically hit. So you see some games that mash together a bunch of bought assets, like character models and photorealistic textures, and then fill in the gaps with half-assed level geometry and whatnot. And the whole thing looks like a disjointed mess. It's like a hobo wearing an expensive blazer. So you don't just need high quality assets, no, not necessarily high fidelity, but you also need some art direction in how you put it together. Something to keep in mind. I mean, that's really at the heart of art direction, right? Ideally, it's composing every possible frame as if it were its own painting. You know, like they do it in movies. They arrange everything on set to create the picture they want, and outside of the frame, the whole set is filled with fake lights, like massive soft boxes and stuff, and they dress the actors in colors that complement the scene and so on. And I think that line of thinking is apt in games as well. Think about the contrasts, silhouettes, and colors on the screen, how good everything looks at any given point, and also how everything reads for the player to foster gameplay comprehension, and so on. And that carries into level design as well, so you don't just have to guide the attention and the path of the player, but also how it all looks to them. And again, it's a lofty goal, and I'm not always able to adhere to that principle religiously either, but again, something to keep in mind. Now, there's a broader message in here too. There are certain axioms that an aspiring indie developer might hold, which have carried over from them being a mere gamer. Things like graphics don't matter, story is the most important thing, game design is a piece of cake, developers are just dumb, and I, an intellectual, shall be the one to revolutionize the medium with my brilliant game idea that I've been cooking up since I was a wee lad. But once you get into the weeds of developing your own games, you will soon find many of those presuppositions to be inadequate. Some of them will be dispelled as soon as you run into certain problems in development, but I think others may linger and seep into the finished product. Particularly the graphics thing, because as I said, many developers are not visually inclined, so they may not realize how it looks to the player, and they may never acquire that particular skill. So you might do well to re-examine the knowledge that you go into your first projects with. Maybe you can avoid some pitfalls. Now, this might sound offensive to some players, but the truth is that as you become a creator of art, you will to some degree transcend the status of a mere consumer of art. There are problems you will only notice once you run into them, and the solutions you will only recognize as such if you know the problems. The thing with feedback is, every bit of feedback will tell you something, even if it's just a non-zero amount of people don't like something about your thing, which may have something to do with your thing, or it may be some failing on the part of the critic. At any rate, criticism will be more useful if it clearly expresses the impression of the critic. That's one thing. And the other thing is, unqualified critics will draw incorrect conclusions, so they will give bad advice. But again, advice is only part of a critique, if it's there at all, right? I don't remember who said it, but here's a quote, paraphrasing. If the audience tells you there's something wrong with your work, they're likely right. When they tell you how to fix it, they're likely wrong. And remember, you're making games to be played by that audience, so it is important to know how they feel about it. It's just that it's your job to engineer those feelings through your work. Another thing to remember about any type of consumer of your work when talking feedback, they are not your colleagues, they are your guinea pigs. They can make you aware of the problems, but ultimately it's your job to fix them. But players' suggestions can absolutely be valid and useful. Just know that they're stepping in the dark because they don't have insight in your project, and again, they may not have insight into game development at all. I've often got ideas of my own from suggestions that got me thinking, but rarely was I able to take anything as is. So, bit of a tangent there. What was I talking about? Oh yes, I have a game out on Steam. Slasher's Keep is a first-person roguelike with a focus on melee combat and loot. It has randomly generated dungeons with orcs, mole rats, and other monsters to fight, lots of loot to find, and a drag-and-drop weapon crafting system. I made it all by my lonesome, and it's available for PC on Steam.